Chapter 11. Hannah's steps slowed as she neared the schoolhouse. She had to force her feet to continue up to the building and into the lean-to. Not until she took off her bonnet did she notice the quiet. She realized then that the schoolyard had been empty. No one was in the lean-to, and she knew before walking into the schoolroom that she would see no students there. Miss Walters sat at her desk writing in the ledger. As Hannah slid into her seat, she heard footsteps in the lean-to. Sam entered, followed by Dolly, Bess, and Sadie, Bess's sister. By the time Miss Walters rapped on her desk to begin the school day, no other students had arrived. Hannah stole a glance at Sam. He hunched over a book, but she could tell that he wasn't reading it. He was staring at nothing, his usual cheery countenance replaced by a scowl, which made her stomach knot in foreboding. "Good morning, students. Take out your readers." Miss Walters apparently intended for school to progress as usual, despite the absence of most of the students. Hannah saw Bess and Dolly exchange quizzical looks. Then a timid knock sounded at the schoolroom door. Hannah turned and saw Pearl Baxter, Sam's little sister, standing in the doorway. "Good morning, Miss Walters," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Hannah sensed a slight movement across the aisle and looked over to see that Sam had slouched even lower in his seat. With his face all but hidden by the book, only the top of his forehead was visible. "Come in, Pearl," Miss Walters said. No, miss," Pearl said. She took a sideways step and clutched the doorframe. I've come to fetch Sam home." Miss Walters tilted her head a little and spoke gently. "I hope there's nothing wrong." No, miss. Ma said to tell you he's needed at home." Pearl looked as if she were about to cry. "Sam?" "Ma said that if I came home without you, I'll get a whipping." Hannah clenched her jaws against the familiar twinned feelings of anger and helplessness. Poor little girl, her own mother scaring her like that. Sam stood abruptly. "It's all right, Pearl. It's not your fault. I'm coming now." He walked to the door, then paused and glanced back at the teacher. "I'm sorry, miss." Miss Walters cleared her throat. "Sam, please tell your parents that if it's not spring planting or fall harvest, the law requires children to attend school, so long as there's no illness or death in the family." "Yes, miss." He shook his head, then mumbled, "They know that." He took his sister's hand. She looked up at him, her lower lip trembling. He made a face, crossing his eyes and sticking out his tongue. To Hannah's relief, Pearl smiled. They left, closing the door quietly. Neither one of them said goodbye. Hannah drew in a long breath, trying to relax her jaw. "I thought their aim would be to stop me. I didn't think they'd stop their own children instead." By being in class, she was preventing nearly all the other students from getting an education. "I can't do that. I'll have to leave school." So they'd succeeded, those townspeople who were against her. In the midst of her terrible disappointment, she also felt a moment of appreciation for Sam. His parents were angry that Hannah was going to school. They would have wanted him to stay home. He had disobeyed them and slipped out of his house. A brave thing to have done. Miss Walters was sitting with her fingers interlaced beneath her chin, looking very thoughtful. Then she raised her head and looked at Hannah, Bess, and Dolly at the back of the room. "Fifth reader class, please rise and pass to the front." Her voice sounded perfectly normal. Hannah could only stare, frozen in surprise. "Fifth reader class," Miss Walters said, a little more severely. As Hannah jumped to her feet, she saw Bess and Dolly stand, looking every bit as puzzled as Hannah felt. "Girls, you're here to get an education, are you not?" "Yes, miss," Hannah said. "Yes, miss," Bess echoed, while Dolly nodded, her eyes wide. "And I've been hired to teach school. I will fulfill my duty by teaching any pupil in attendance." Her voice grew louder and her cheeks flushed pink as she spoke. She sounded almost angry. Hannah's gaze met the teacher's and held it for a moment. Miss Walters had just made her realize something important. She has a choice. She could tell the school board not to let me attend, but she isn't doing that. The families of the other students, they could send their children to school or not. They're free to choose. So am I. She raised her chin a little, and Miss Walters seemed to acknowledge her with the tiniest of nods. Then Miss Walters smiled and shrugged. "But it does seem silly for you to have to sit in the back row. Why don't you come to the front desks?" So the three of them moved their books to seats in the second row next to Sadie. Miss Walters opened her reader, and the school day began. The morning was quite ordinary. The lessons proceeded as usual, no better than usual. Sadie, small for her age and pale and shy, clearly relished having her big sister Bess seated next to her. Miss Walters was able to devote all her attention to just the two classes, Sadie in the third reader and the big girls in the fifth. The room was quieter, too, because of fewer students, or no boys, or both. Hannah especially enjoyed the history hour, where she and Bess took turns answering the questions Miss Walters put to them. Dolly faltered after just one question, and confessed that she did not know the lesson. At the noon hour, Bess and Sadie went home for their dinner. Dolly's family lived on a claim, too far out of town for her to go home. But she never stayed in the schoolhouse. Instead, she always walked through town, stopping to look in the shops. "Would you like to walk with me?" Dolly asked. She was looking at Hannah, who was so astonished that she almost glanced over her shoulder to see who Dolly might be addressing. But of course, no one else was there. I was going to go over the spelling lesson," Hannah replied. "I've heard you spell," Dolly said with a friendly smile. "You're the best in class, you and Bess. You don't need to go over it. Come for a walk instead." The unexpected invitation left Hannah flustered. "Maybe, but I don't know. I'd rather not go into town." "That's all right then. We'll just take a turn around the schoolyard, and then you can walk me as far as Main Street." The yard was nothing but bare prairie, with the well in the middle and the privy in one corner. It actually wasn't a yard at all, just the space between the school building and the street corner. The town most likely had plans for a path and plantings, and maybe even trees next year, but for now the schoolyard, like LaForge itself, was raw and unfinished. Hannah and Dolly strolled around the edge of the lot. "It's so strange, isn't it?" Dolly said with a giggle. "Just the four of us all morning." "So your parents don't mind that you're in school with me?" "Oh, they don't know. They only come to town once or twice a month, so they haven't heard anything about you yet, and I haven't told them." Hannah considered this. "What do you think they'll say when they find out?" "Why, they'll make me stop coming, of course," Dolly replied. Hannah said nothing. It was clear that Dolly had no notion that what she had just said was hurtful. Hannah was annoyed at herself for not anticipating the answer, and the hurt. Dolly put her arm through Hannah's, which startled her so much that she instinctively pulled away. "Oh, now," Dolly said. "I won't bite, I promise." She giggled again. "She's not very reliable. All this time she's been turning up her nose at me, and she chooses today to start being friendly? Not a coincidence. It's because most of the other students aren't here to see it." Hannah took a little breath and relaxed her arm. Not letting down her guard, she still felt wary about Dolly. But it was nice walking with a girl her age, even when she had to pretend to like. "I never knew anybody Chinese before," Dolly said as they reached the far side of the yard. "It's kind of exciting." "I guess you wouldn't," Hannah said quietly. "Dakota Territory isn't far enough west. There are lots of Chinese and other Asians, too, if you go farther west." "My goodness, this is far enough west for me," Dolly exclaimed. "I'd love to go back east, where there are lots of real stores and amusing things to do. It's so dull out here. There's never anything to do but work." She pouted for a moment, but quickly regained her cheerful mood. "Listen, I want to ask you something. I'm sure you won't mind, seeing as you already understand about there being no Chinese here. You don't mind, do you?" "I won't know until you ask," Hannah said. Dolly shrieked with laughter. "Well, of course you wouldn't. How silly of me. Sometimes I just don't know what's going to come out of my mouth." Then she pulled a little closer to Hannah. "Your eyes," she said. "They're shaped so different. Is it hard for you to see?" Hannah hadn't realized that she'd been holding her breath until that moment. She let it out slowly, a tiny bit at a time, which wasn't easy when what she really wanted to do was heave a tremendous sigh, a sigh of weariness.